On April 15, 1969, North Korea shot a United States military aircraft out of the sky, killing all 31 American servicemen on board. The plane was unarmed on a routine intelligence mission flying in international airspace. And America's response? Almost nothing. This is the story they don't want you to remember, and once you hear what really happened, you'll understand why. The EC-121 shootdown is one of those moments in history that got buried under layers of political convenience and Cold War complications. While everyone talks about the Cuban Missile Crisis or the Vietnam War when discussing Cold War tensions, hardly anyone mentions the day North Korea committed an act of war against the United States and got away with it completely. Today, I'm going to walk you through exactly what happened on that day, why the American government made the decisions they did, and how this incident shaped everything that came after in terms of how North Korea behaves on the world stage. Because here's the thing. If you want to understand why North Korea acts the way it does today, you need to understand this moment when they tested America's limits and found out they could push further than anyone expected. Let me set up the problem we're dealing with here. In April 1969, the United States was already stretched thin. American forces were deeply involved in Vietnam, with over 500,000 troops deployed and casualties mounting every week. The American public was becoming increasingly opposed to the war. Protests were erupting on college campuses across the country. The government was facing pressure from multiple directions to de-escalate military commitments, not expand them. At the same time, North Korea under Kim Il-sung was testing boundaries constantly. Just a year earlier, in January 1968, North Korean commandos had attempted to assassinate the South Korean president by raiding the Blue House in Seoul. That same month, North Korea captured the USS Pueblo, a Navy intelligence ship, and held its crew hostage for nearly a year. The crew was tortured and used for propaganda purposes, and the United States ultimately had to apologize and negotiate for their release, even though the ship had been in international waters. So by April 1969, there was already a pattern established. North Korea would commit aggressive acts, and the United States would respond with restraint because the alternatives, meaning military escalation, seemed worse than accepting the provocation. This created a dangerous dynamic where Kim Il-sung felt emboldened to push harder and harder to see what he could get away with. The challenge facing American decision-makers was this: how do you respond to direct attacks on your military without starting another full-scale war? The United States was already fighting in Vietnam. The last thing the government wanted was to open a second major conflict on the Korean Peninsula. But at the same time, not responding to attacks sent a message of weakness that could invite even more aggression. This created a dangerous dynamic where Kim Il-sung felt emboldened to push harder and harder to see what he could get away with. The challenge facing American decision-makers was this: how do you respond to direct attacks on your military without starting another full-scale war? The United States was already fighting in Vietnam. The last thing the government wanted was to open a second major conflict on the Korean Peninsula. But at the same time, not responding to attacks sent a message of weakness that could invite even more aggression. This is the impossible situation that frames everything about the EC-121 incident. American military commanders wanted strong retaliation. The Joint Chiefs of Staff were pushing for strikes against North Korean targets. But President Richard Nixon, who had only been in office for a few months at this point, was facing political realities that limited his options. He had campaigned on a promise to wind down American military involvement abroad, not expand it. So when North Korea shot down that spy plane, killing 31 Americans, the question wasn't just about what happened that day. It was about what response was politically possible, militarily advisable, and strategically wise given everything else happening in the world at that moment. And as we'll see, the answer that the Nixon administration came up with satisfied almost nobody and had consequences that are still playing out today. Let me take you back to the morning of April 15, 1969, and explain exactly what happened, who was involved, and how a routine intelligence flight turned into a deadly international incident that almost started a war. The aircraft involved was an EC-121M Warning Star. This was a modified version of the Lockheed Constellation, which was originally designed as a commercial passenger plane but had been adapted for military use. The EC-121 was packed with electronic surveillance equipment and radar systems. Its job was to fly along the borders of communist countries, monitoring their radar installations, radio communications, and military activities. These missions were called reconnaissance flights, and they were a standard part of Cold War intelligence gathering. The specific plane that flew that day was nicknamed EC-129. It was assigned to Fleet Air Reconnaissance Squadron 1 based out of Naval Air Station Atsugi in Japan. The squadron's job was to monitor North Korea and provide early warning of any military movements or communications that might indicate hostile intentions. These flights happened regularly, multiple times per week, following established patterns that both sides knew well. The crew that morning consisted of 31 men. There were pilots, navigators, radio operators, electronic warfare specialists, maintenance personnel, and intelligence analysts. Most were Navy personnel, but there were also 2 Marines and some civilian contractors who operated the specialized surveillance equipment. These weren't combat troops, they were technical specialists doing intelligence work. The average age was somewhere in the mid-20s. Many were married with families back home. The mission plan for that day was straightforward and routine. EC-129 would take off from Atsugi, fly to a designated patrol area off the coast of North Korea, orbit in that area while collecting intelligence for several hours, and then return to base. The patrol area was well within international waters, specifically about 90 miles off the North Korean coast. International law at the time recognized 12 miles as territorial waters, so the flight plan kept them a comfortable distance away from any area North Korea could legitimately claim. The flight took off in the early morning hours. Everything was normal during the initial flight to the patrol area. The crew went through their standard procedures, setting up the surveillance equipment, establishing radio contact with their base, and beginning their monitoring activities. For several hours, they flew their patrol pattern, collecting signals intelligence just like they had done dozens of times before. What the crew didn't know was that North Korean air defense forces were tracking them from the moment they entered the patrol area. North Korean radar stations along the coast were watching EC-129's movements. North Korean military commanders were receiving reports about the American spy plane's position and course. And at some point during that morning, someone in the North Korean chain of command made the decision to shoot it down. Around midday, 2 North Korean MiG-21 fighters took off from an airbase near Wonsan on the east coast of North Korea. The MiG-21 was a Soviet-designed fighter jet, fast and maneuverable, armed with air-to-air missiles and cannons. These particular aircraft were part of North Korea's Air Defense Force, and their pilots were trained specifically for intercepting enemy aircraft. The 2 MiGs flew out over the Sea of Japan, heading toward the position where EC-129 was conducting its patrol. The American crew would have seen them approaching on radar, but this wasn't necessarily alarming at first. North Korean fighters sometimes scrambled to shadow American reconnaissance planes. It was a form of harassment and signaling, but actual attacks were rare because everyone understood the risks of escalation. But this time was different. The MiGs closed to within firing range, and without any warning, they launched missiles at EC-129. The American plane had no defensive weapons, no countermeasures, nothing to protect itself. It was built for surveillance, not combat. The crew's only option would have been to try to evade, but the EC-121 was a large, slow aircraft compared to fighter jets. It didn't stand a chance. The missiles struck the aircraft, causing catastrophic damage. Exactly what happened in those final moments is unclear because obviously nobody survived to describe it. But based on the wreckage that was later recovered, the plane appears to have broken apart quickly after being hit. It fell from approximately 1,000 feet altitude into the Sea of Japan. All 31 men aboard died. Some may have died instantly from the missile impact or the initial breakup of the aircraft. Others may have survived long enough to realize what was happening as the plane fell toward the water. The impact with the ocean at that speed would have been fatal for anyone still alive at that point. The water temperature in the Sea of Japan in April is cold enough that even if anyone somehow survived the crash, they would have died from hypothermia within minutes. The first indication that something was wrong came when EC-129 failed to make a scheduled radio check-in. Controllers at Atsugi tried repeatedly to raise the aircraft on the radio, but there was no response. Search and rescue operations were launched immediately. American ships and aircraft began searching the area where the plane had last been detected. Within hours, debris from the aircraft began washing up and being spotted floating in the sea. Pieces of the fuselage, equipment, personal effects of the crew. Over the following days and weeks, the search effort recovered 2 bodies and substantial wreckage that confirmed the plane had been shot down. The bodies that were recovered showed no signs of having survived the impact. The wreckage showed clear evidence of missile damage. At first, there was hope that some crew members might have survived and been picked up by North Korean vessels. There were reports of North Korean patrol boats in the area shortly after the shootdown. But it became clear relatively quickly that nobody had survived. North Korea never claimed to have captured any survivors, and no evidence ever emerged suggesting anyone lived through the incident. The news reached Washington during the night of April 14-15, which was still April 15 in Japan due to time zones. President Nixon was awakened and briefed on the situation. The initial reports were fragmentary because the search was still ongoing, but it was clear that an American military aircraft had been lost near North Korea and that all hands were presumed dead. Nixon's first question, according to people who were present, was whether the aircraft had been in international or North Korean airspace. This was the critical question because it would determine what kind of response was justified. His advisors confirmed that the plane had been well outside North Korean territorial waters, following an approved flight plan in international airspace. This meant that North Korea had committed an unprovoked attack on an American military aircraft that had every right to be where it was. The president's national security team began meeting throughout that day and into the next, trying to figure out how to respond. The military options ranged from doing nothing all the way up to launching retaliatory strikes against North Korean airfields and military installations. The Joint Chiefs of Staff were leaning heavily toward the strike option. They argued that North Korea needed to face consequences for killing American servicemen and that failing to respond would invite further attacks. But there were major problems with the military response options. First, any strike on North Korea risked starting a war. North Korea had a massive army positioned along the demilitarized zone separating North and South Korea. If hostilities broke out, Seoul, the South Korean capital with millions of people, was within artillery range of North Korean positions. The potential for casualties was enormous. Second, the United States had a formal defense treaty with South Korea, which meant that if North Korea and the United States went to war, South Korea would be automatically involved. But the South Korean government hadn't been consulted before any of this happened, and they were not enthusiastic about being dragged into a conflict over an American spy plane. Third, and this was probably the biggest factor, the United States was already fighting in Vietnam. American military resources were stretched. Public opinion was turning against military intervention. Nixon had been elected partly on promises to reduce American military commitments abroad. Starting a second Asian war 3 months into his presidency was not politically viable. So the administration was stuck. They couldn't ignore the attack because that would make America look weak and encourage more aggression. But they couldn't retaliate militarily without risking consequences that seemed worse than the original provocation. This is the dilemma that shaped everything that followed. Let me walk you through the decision-making process in more detail because understanding the internal debates in Washington helps explain why the response played out the way it did. The key players were President Nixon, his National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger, Secretary of State William Rogers, and Secretary of Defense Melvin Laird, along with the Joint Chiefs of Staff representing the military. The Joint Chiefs wanted immediate and strong military action. They proposed several options. One was to bomb the North Korean airbase where the MiGs had come from. Another was to conduct strikes against North Korean radar installations and air defense sites. A third option was to impose a naval blockade on North Korean ports. The generals argued that America needed to demonstrate that attacking U.S. forces came with a price, and that weakness would only invite more attacks. Henry Kissinger was more cautious, but he agreed that some form of retaliation was necessary. He was concerned about the signal that inaction would send not just to North Korea, but to the Soviet Union and China. The Cold War was fundamentally about perceptions of power and resolve. If America backed down from this, it might embolden communist countries elsewhere to take more aggressive actions. Secretary of State Rogers was worried about the diplomatic fallout. He pointed out that America's allies, particularly South Korea and Japan, would bear much of the risk if the situation escalated into war. He also noted that the United Nations Security Council was unlikely to support American military action because the Soviet Union would veto any resolution. This meant the United States would be acting unilaterally, which could damage relationships with other countries. Secretary of Defense Laird was focused on the practical military challenges. He pointed out that conducting strikes on North Korea would require pulling aircraft and ships away from Vietnam. He also noted that North Korea's air defenses were formidable and that any attack would likely result in American casualties. The military simply wasn't in a position to fight effectively on two fronts. Nixon listened to all these arguments and ultimately decided on a middle course. He ordered a naval task force to be assembled and sent toward North Korea as a show of force. He authorized reconnaissance flights to resume, but this time with fighter escorts to protect them. He approved stronger language and diplomatic protests, but he ruled out immediate military strikes. Instead, he wanted to signal strength while leaving room for the situation to de-escalate. This decision satisfied nobody. The military felt handcuffed and frustrated that American deaths were going unanswered. Hawks in Congress accused Nixon of weakness, but doves were relieved that the situation wasn't escalating into another war. The American public, for the most part, barely noticed because the story got relatively little media coverage compared to Vietnam. The naval task force that Nixon ordered consisted of 4 aircraft carriers along with their accompanying destroyers, cruisers, and support ships. This was a massive show of force, one of the largest naval deployments in the region since the Korean War. The carriers were the USS Enterprise, USS Ranger, USS Ticonderoga, and USS Hornet. Together, they carried hundreds of aircraft and thousands of sailors. The task force assembled in the Sea of Japan and conducted exercises within sight of the North Korean coast. American jets flew practice strike runs, demonstrating that they could hit targets inside North Korea if ordered to do so. The message was clear: the United States had the capability to retaliate, and North Korea should not mistake restraint for weakness. Meanwhile, diplomatic channels were working overtime. The United States lodged formal protests with North Korea through the Military Armistice Commission, which was the body that oversaw the ceasefire from the Korean War. North Korea's response was predictable. They claimed that the EC-121 had violated their airspace and that they had every right to shoot it down. They provided coordinates that placed the aircraft inside their territorial limits, coordinates that contradicted all American tracking data and international observations. The Soviet Union and China both backed North Korea's version of events, at least publicly. Neither communist power wanted to see their ally punished, though there's evidence that both were uncomfortable with how aggressive North Korea had become. The Soviets in particular were trying to pursue détente with the United States at this time, and North Korean provocations complicated those efforts. South Korea was in a difficult position. They were allies with the United States and depended on American military support for their security. But they were also the ones who would suffer most if war broke out. South Korean President Park Chung-hee publicly supported the American position, but privately urged restraint and caution. He didn't want his country to become a battlefield again. As days passed without any military action, it became clear that the United States wasn't going to retaliate with force. The Naval Task Force conducted its exercises for a few weeks and then dispersed. Reconnaissance flights resumed with fighter escorts, but North Korea didn't challenge them again. The crisis gradually faded from the headlines. But the incident left lasting scars and established patterns that still affect international relations today. Let me explain some of the long-term consequences that came out of this moment. First, North Korea learned that they could kill Americans without facing serious military consequences. This was a dangerous lesson because it emboldened the regime to continue aggressive behavior. In the decades since, North Korea has attacked South Korean targets, sunk ships, shelled islands, and conducted nuclear and missile tests, all while calculating that the international response will be limited. The EC-121 incident was an early test case that showed them the limits of American willingness to respond with force. Second, the incident contributed to a pattern of American policy toward North Korea that prioritized avoiding war over punishing aggression. Every administration since then, whether Democrat or Republican, has ultimately chosen containment and deterrence over direct military action against North Korea. This is partly because the risks of war on the Korean Peninsula are so catastrophic, but it's also because the EC-121 incident established a precedent that has been hard to break. Third, the families of the 31 men who died that day were left without real answers or justice. Some of the bodies were never recovered. The families were told their loved ones died in service to their country, which was true, but there was no accountability for the people who killed them. North Korea faced no punishment. The pilots who fired the missiles were probably celebrated as heroes by their government. This lack of closure has stayed with the families for over 50 years. Fourth, the incident affected how the United States conducts reconnaissance operations. After the EC-121 shootdown, procedures were changed to provide better protection for surveillance aircraft. Fighter escorts became standard for flights near hostile territory. Routes were adjusted to stay even further from disputed areas. The rules of engagement were clarified so that crews knew under what circumstances they could defend themselves or withdraw. Let me tell you more about the men who died that day, because they deserve to be remembered as individuals, not just as statistics. The crew ranged in age from 19 to 42. They came from all over the United States, from small towns and big cities, from different backgrounds and experiences. What they had in common was that they volunteered to serve in the military, they trained for specialized technical roles, and they died doing a job that most people never knew existed. The pilot in command that day was Lieutenant Commander James Overstreet. He was an experienced naval aviator who had flown many reconnaissance missions. He was married with children. By all accounts, he was a skilled pilot and a good leader who took care of his crew. The last decision he made before the attack was probably to continue the mission as planned, because everything seemed routine, and there was no reason to expect that North Korea would escalate to shooting down an American aircraft in international waters. Among the crew were young enlisted men who operated the surveillance equipment. These were specialists in radio interception, radar analysis, and signals intelligence. They spent their days listening to foreign military communications, tracking radar signals, and piecing together information about enemy capabilities and intentions. It was technical, unglamorous work that required concentration and expertise. Most people they met had no idea what their actual job involved because it was classified. There were maintenance personnel on the flight whose job was to keep the complex electronic systems running during the long missions. These were the guys who could troubleshoot equipment problems, swap out malfunctioning components, and keep everything operational. On a normal mission, they spent their time monitoring systems and fixing issues as they arose. That day, they had no time to react before the missiles hit. Some of the crew members were on their first deployment. For them, this was supposed to be the start of their military career, a chance to serve their country and learn skills they could use later in civilian life. They had gone through training, said goodbye to their families, and reported to their squadron expecting to spend a year or two doing intelligence work before rotating back to the United States. They never got that chance. The families back home found out through the military notification system. Officers showed up at houses and apartments to deliver the news that their son or husband or father was missing and presumed dead. In the days that followed, as the search continued and bodies and wreckage were recovered, those presumptions became certainties. The families were left to grieve while the government debated how to respond. Memorial services were held at naval installations and in hometowns across America. The men were honored for their service and sacrifice. But for many families, the lack of response to the attack added another layer of pain. Their loved ones had been killed by a foreign government, and that government faced no consequences. There was no justice, no accountability, just the hollow phrase that they had died in service to their country. 2 of the bodies were eventually recovered from the sea and returned to their families for burial. The other 29 were never found. They remain lost in the Sea of Japan, wherever the wreckage of Deep Sea 129 finally came to rest on the ocean floor. There's a memorial at Naval Air Station Atsugi in Japan that honors the crew. Their names are listed on the memorial wall at the Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, Florida. But these are just stone and metal. They can't bring the men back or answer the question of why their deaths went unavenged.
Now, let me talk about the broader context of reconnaissance flights during the Cold War, because understanding what these missions were trying to accomplish helps explain why both sides took them so seriously. The United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a global competition where information was power. Each side wanted to know what the other side was capable of, what they were planning, where their weaknesses were. But getting that information was incredibly difficult because communist countries were closed societies that guarded their military secrets carefully. Reconnaissance flights were one of the primary methods for gathering this intelligence. By flying along borders and monitoring radio and radar signals, American aircraft could learn about enemy air defenses, communication systems, and military readiness. They could track where units were positioned, what equipment they had, how they conducted training exercises. Over time, this built up a detailed picture of enemy capabilities that was essential for military planning and crisis management. The flights operated in international airspace, which was legal under international law. But from the perspective of countries like North Korea, they were provocative and threatening. Imagine if foreign military aircraft were constantly flying just outside your borders, clearly monitoring everything you did, gathering information that could be used against you in a war. You'd probably find that intimidating and hostile, even if it was technically legal. This created a constant tension. The United States insisted on its right to fly in international airspace and gather intelligence. Communist countries protested these flights as acts of aggression and occasionally took action against them. Over the years, multiple American reconnaissance aircraft were shot down or forced down by Soviet, Chinese, and North Korean forces. Crews were killed or captured. Each incident created a crisis that could have escalated into war. The most famous example before the EC-121 was the U-2 incident in 1960, when the Soviet Union shot down an American spy plane deep inside Soviet territory. That incident destroyed a planned summit between President Eisenhower and Soviet Premier Khrushchev and set back relations for years. The pilot, Gary Powers, was captured and used for propaganda before being exchanged for a Soviet spy. The EC-121 incident was different because the aircraft was clearly in international waters, not over enemy territory. This made North Korea's action even harder to justify under international law. But it also showed that North Korea was willing to violate international norms if it served their purposes, and that they calculated correctly that the United States wouldn't risk war over a single incident. Let's go deeper into North Korea's motivations for shooting down the plane. What were they trying to accomplish, and why did they think this was a good idea? To understand this, you need to know where North Korea was at that moment in its history, and what Kim Il-sung was trying to achieve. By 1969, North Korea had been divided from South Korea for over 20 years. The Korean War had ended in 1953 with an armistice, not a peace treaty, which meant that two countries were technically still at war. Kim Il-sung had consolidated total power in North Korea, establishing a personality cult and a system of control that touched every aspect of society. His goal was to reunify Korea under communist rule. But Kim faced obstacles. The United States had troops stationed in South Korea and a commitment to defend the South against invasion. South Korea's economy was starting to grow and develop, creating a stark contrast with conditions in the North. China and the Soviet Union, North Korea's main allies, were locked in their own dispute and couldn't be counted on for unconditional support. Kim needed to demonstrate that North Korea was strong and wouldn't be intimidated by American power. The USS Pueblo capture in January 1968 had been a propaganda victory for North Korea. They had seized an American ship, humiliated its crew, and forced the United States to apologize to get them back. This showed that America could be pushed around, and it raised Kim's prestige both domestically and internationally. Shooting down the EC-121 was likely intended to build on that success, to further demonstrate that North Korea wouldn't tolerate American surveillance and could strike at American forces without fear of consequences. There's also evidence that Kim Il-sung was trying to provoke a crisis that would force China and the Soviet Union to provide more support. If the United States retaliated, North Korea could claim it was under attack and demand assistance from its allies. This was a dangerous game, but Kim had played it before and gotten away with it. His calculation seems to have been that the risk of American military action was low, especially given how tied down the United States was in Vietnam. Another factor was internal North Korean politics. Kim needed to keep his military happy and maintain the image that North Korea was strong and defiant. Shooting down an American spy plane accomplished both goals. It gave the military a victory to celebrate, and it showed the North Korean people that their country wouldn't back down from the American threat. The propaganda value inside North Korea was probably worth more to Kim than any international consequences. So from Kim's perspective, the shootdown made sense. It advanced multiple objectives, the risk of serious retaliation seemed low, and even if there was some international backlash, he could weather it. And as it turned out, he was right. The United States sent some ships, made some protests, and then moved on. North Korea faced no real punishment, and Kim was emboldened to continue his aggressive approach to foreign relations. Now let me take you through the American decision-making in more detail, because this is really the heart of why this incident is so significant. The debate within the Nixon administration revealed fundamental questions about how to respond to aggression when your options are all bad. The case for military retaliation was straightforward. North Korea had killed 31 Americans in an unprovoked attack on an aircraft in international waters. This was an act of war under any reasonable definition. Failing to respond would signal weakness and invite further attacks. American credibility was at stake, not just with North Korea, but with allies and adversaries around the world who were watching to see what the United States would do. The military had specific targets in mind. The airbase at Wonsan, where the MiGs had come from, was an obvious choice. North Korean radar installations along the coast were another option. Some hawks wanted to go further and strike at leadership targets or military headquarters. The aircraft carriers assembled in the Sea of Japan had the capability to deliver devastating strikes that would severely damage North Korea's military infrastructure. But the case against retaliation was equally compelling. Starting a war on the Korean peninsula would be catastrophic. Hundreds of thousands or millions of people could die. Seoul could be destroyed. American forces would be fighting on two fronts, in Vietnam and Korea, which might not be militarily sustainable. Allies like South Korea and Japan were opposed to military action because they would bear the consequences. And the American public was tired of war and wouldn't support opening a new conflict. There was also the question of what retaliation would actually accomplish. Bombing North Korea wouldn't bring the dead crew members back. It probably wouldn't deter future North Korean aggression because the regime was willing to accept punishment in pursuit of its goals. And it might provoke North Korea to escalate even further, attacking South Korea or American bases in the region. The potential costs seem to outweigh the potential benefits. Nixon and Kissinger also had to consider the Cold War context. The Soviet Union had a mutual defense treaty with North Korea. If the United States attacked North Korea, there was at least a possibility that the Soviets would feel obligated to respond. Nobody thought the Soviets would start a nuclear war over North Korea, but even a conventional response could be dangerous. And the Soviet-American relationship was delicate at this moment, with arms control negotiations and other issues on the table that could be derailed by a crisis in Korea. China was another wild card. The Chinese had fought in the Korean War to prevent North Korea from being conquered, and they still saw North Korea as a buffer state protecting their border. If the United States attacked North Korea, what would China do? The risk of Chinese intervention, like in 1950, was probably low but not zero. And Nixon was already thinking ahead to his historic opening to China that would happen a few years later. He didn't want to poison that possibility by getting into a military confrontation now. So Nixon chose restraint, but restraint with signaling. The Naval Task Force demonstrated American military power and capability. The fighter escorts for future reconnaissance flights showed that the United States wouldn't be intimidated into stopping intelligence gathering. The diplomatic protests and public statements made clear that America held North Korea responsible. But there were no bombs, no missiles, no shots fired in retaliation. This decision has been debated ever since. Did Nixon do the right thing by avoiding war, or did he make a mistake that encouraged North Korean aggression for decades to come? There's no clear answer because we can't know what would have happened if he had chosen differently. Maybe military retaliation would have taught North Korea a lesson and prevented future provocations. Or maybe it would have started a catastrophic war that would make us look back on the restrained response as wise statesmanship. What we do know is that North Korea continued to engage in provocative behavior after the EC-121 incident. In the 1970s and 80s, they conducted terrorism and assassination attempts. In the 1990s, they started developing nuclear weapons. In the 2000s and 2010s, they conducted nuclear tests and developed ballistic missiles. Throughout all of this, the international community has responded with sanctions, negotiations, and threats, but not with military action. The pattern established in 1969 has held. Let me talk now about how this incident was covered in the media and perceived by the American public, because the domestic reaction reveals something important about where America was at that moment in time. The shoot-down happened in April 1969, just a few months into Nixon's presidency. The country was deeply divided over Vietnam. The counterculture movement was at its peak. Trust in government was declining. People were questioning American military involvement abroad. When news of the EC-121 shoot-down first broke, there was initial outrage. The idea that North Korea had killed Americans in international waters sparked anger and calls for revenge. Some newspapers and politicians demanded military retaliation. But this outrage faded relatively quickly, especially as it became clear that the government wasn't planning to take military action. Within a week or two, the story had largely disappeared from the front pages, replaced by coverage of Vietnam and domestic issues. Part of this was deliberate government management. The Nixon administration didn't want to inflame public opinion and create pressure for military action they didn't want to take. So they downplayed the incident somewhat, emphasizing that intelligence gathering would continue, but avoiding rhetoric that would suggest war was imminent. The strategy worked. Public attention moved on. But part of it was also just that the American public was exhausted by conflict. People were tired of hearing about Americans dying in distant places. The Vietnam War had created a sense of frustration and helplessness about military adventures abroad. When the EC-121 shootdown happened, many people's reaction was more sadness and resignation than anger and determination. There was a sense that this was just another terrible thing happening in a world full of terrible things. The families of the crew members felt abandoned by this reaction. They had lost loved ones, and the country seemed to barely notice or care. There was no national mourning, no sustained media attention, no sense that this was a defining moment that required a response. The men who died became almost a footnote in history, remembered by their families and by military historians, but forgotten by the general public. This reflects something broader about how America was changing in the late 1960s. The consensus that had supported Cold War interventionism was breaking down. People were questioning whether American military power should be used to check communist expansion everywhere in the world. The costs were starting to seem higher than the benefits. The EC-121 incident happened right in the middle of this transition, and the muted public response showed that Americans weren't willing to support another war. So here's the moment that defines this entire story. On April 20, 1969, 5 days after the shootdown, President Nixon met with his National Security Council for a final decision on how to respond. All the options had been laid out, all the arguments had been made. The military wanted action. The diplomats urged caution. The intelligence community was divided. Nixon had to choose. He decided that the United States would not conduct military strikes against North Korea. The Naval Task Force would continue its show of force for a period of time and then withdraw. Reconnaissance flights would resume with protection. Diplomatic protests would continue, but there would be no war, no bombs, no retaliation that would risk escalation. This was the moment when North Korea learned they could kill Americans and get away with it. This was the moment when the pattern was set for decades of provocations and limited responses. This was the moment when 31 men died and their deaths went without meaningful consequences. You can argue about whether Nixon made the right choice. The alternatives were all terrible in different ways. But the significance of this moment can't be denied. It shaped everything that came after, in terms of how North Korea behaves, how the United States responds, and what the limits of American power turned out to be in a world where escalation to war was too dangerous to contemplate. Let me bring this all together and explain why the EC-121 shootdown matters today, over 50 years after it happened. This incident was a defining moment in Cold War history that revealed the limitations of American power and the calculations that authoritarian regimes make when testing the resolve of democracies. On April 15, 1969, North Korea shot down an unarmed American reconnaissance aircraft in international waters, killing all 31 men aboard. The plane was conducting a routine intelligence mission, monitoring North Korean military communications and radar. It had every legal right to be where it was. The attack was unprovoked and unjustified under any interpretation of international law. The United States faced an impossible choice about how to respond. Military retaliation was an option, and the military strongly advocated for it. But President Nixon decided that the risks of escalation were too high, given America's commitment in Vietnam, the danger to South Korea, and the potential for a broader war. He chose a show of force without actual use of force, sending carriers to the region but not authorizing strikes. North Korea faced no serious consequences for the attack. They claimed the plane had violated their airspace, which was false. They celebrated the shootdown as a victory. They learned that they could kill Americans without triggering war, and they applied this lesson repeatedly in the decades that followed, engaging in provocations and attacks while calculating that the international response would be limited. The 31 men who died that day deserved better. They volunteered to serve their country. They were doing important work, gathering intelligence that helped keep America and its allies safe. They followed orders and did their jobs professionally. And when they were murdered by a hostile regime, their government chose not to seek justice or accountability because the political and military calculations didn't support it. This raises profound questions about the nature of deterrence and the use of military power. How do you deter aggression if you're unwilling to respond when aggression occurs? How do you protect your forces if attacking them carries no serious consequences? How do you maintain credibility with allies and adversaries if you accept provocations without retaliation? These questions don't have easy answers, and the EC-121 incident shows why. The families of the crew members have lived with this for over 5 decades now. Most of those family members are elderly now, and some have passed away. But the pain and the lack of closure remain. 2 bodies were recovered and given proper burials. 29 men are still out there somewhere in the Sea of Japan, their final resting place unknown. Their families never got to say goodbye properly. They never saw justice done. They just had to accept that their loved ones died and the world moved on. The incident also exposed the differences between how military personnel and civilian leadership view these situations. The military tends to see things in terms of honor, duty, and the need to respond to attacks on American forces. Civilian leaders have to weigh those considerations against political realities, diplomatic consequences, and the risk of wider conflict. Neither perspective is wrong, but they often lead to different conclusions about what should be done. In the years since 1969, we've seen this same dynamic play out repeatedly. North Korea sank the South Korean warship Chonan in 2010, killing 46 sailors. The international response was sanctions and condemnation, but no military action. North Korea shelled Yeonpyeong Island later that year, killing South Korean Marines and civilians. Again, the response was limited. North Korea has conducted nuclear tests, launched missiles over Japan, and engaged in countless provocations. Each time, the international community responds with measures short of war, because the alternative seems too catastrophic. The incident also exposed the differences between how military personnel and civilian leadership view these situations. The military tends to see things in terms of honor, duty, and the need to respond to attacks on American forces. Civilian leaders have to weigh those considerations against political realities, diplomatic consequences, and the risk of wider conflict. Neither perspective is wrong, but they often lead to different conclusions about what should be done. In the years since 1969, we've seen this same dynamic play out repeatedly. North Korea sank the South Korean warship Chonan in 2010, killing 46 sailors. The international response was sanctions and condemnation, but no military action. North Korea shelled Yeonpyeong Island later that year, killing South Korean Marines and civilians. Again, the response was limited. North Korea has conducted nuclear tests, launched missiles over Japan, and engaged in countless provocations. Each time, the international community responds with measures short of war because the alternative seems too catastrophic. You can draw a direct line from the EC-121 incident to North Korea's behavior today. They learned that there are things they can do without triggering war. They learned that democracies are risk-averse and will choose restraint over escalation in most situations. They learned that killing small numbers of people in limited attacks won't generate the kind of response that threatens the regime's survival. And they've built their entire foreign policy approach around exploiting these lessons. Does this mean Nixon was wrong not to retaliate in 1969? Not necessarily. War on the Korean Peninsula would have been horrific. Hundreds of thousands of people would have died. Seoul might have been destroyed. American casualties could have been enormous. The Vietnam War was already straining American military capabilities and public support. Opening a second major conflict might not have been sustainable. So, the decision to avoid war was understandable and possibly correct. But it came with costs that are still being paid. North Korea is now a nuclear power with missiles that can reach the United States. They've proliferated weapons technology to other countries and groups. They've maintained one of the world's most oppressive regimes, keeping millions of people in poverty and tyranny. They continue to threaten their neighbors and periodically engage in provocations. All of this was enabled partly by the lessons they learned about what they could get away with. The EC-121 incident also says something about how the world has changed since the Cold War. In 1969, the dominant concern was avoiding a war between major powers that could escalate to nuclear conflict. This made everyone cautious about responding to provocations. Today, we still worry about escalation, but the dynamics are different. North Korea has nuclear weapons now, which makes the calculus even more complicated. Any military action against North Korea carries the risk of nuclear retaliation, which wasn't a factor in 1969. This means that the pattern established in 1969 has become even more entrenched. North Korea knows that as long as they don't do something so extreme that it forces a response, they can operate with relative impunity. They can test missiles, conduct nuclear tests, hack foreign companies, assassinate dissidents abroad, and the response will be sanctions and statements rather than military action. The EC-121 shootdown was the proof of concept that this approach works. For historians and military analysts, the incident remains a case study in the limits of military power and the challenges of deterrence. How do you deter a regime that's willing to accept enormous risks and costs? How do you respond to provocations when all your options are bad? How do you balance the desire for justice and accountability against the need to avoid catastrophic war? The EC-121 incident doesn't answer these questions, but it illuminates them clearly. The incident also reminds us that there are real human costs to these geopolitical calculations. When we talk about deterrence and strategic restraint and risk management, we're talking about decisions that affect real people. The 31 men who died on Deep Sea 129 were real people with families and friends and futures that were cut short. The fact that their deaths served some larger strategic purpose, or failed to serve one, depending on your perspective, doesn't make those deaths any less tragic or meaningful. One of the frustrating things about studying this incident is how little most people know about it. It's been largely forgotten outside of military and intelligence circles. If you ask random Americans about North Korean provocations, they'll mention the nuclear program, or maybe the USS Pueblo if they know their history. But the EC-121 shootdown? Most people have never heard of it. This seems wrong, given that 31 Americans died, but it reflects how the incident was handled at the time and how it's been remembered since. There have been some efforts to keep the memory alive. Veterans groups have held memorial services. Military historians have written about the incident. The families of the crew members have worked to ensure their loved ones are remembered. But these are small-scale efforts that reach limited audiences. There's no national memorial, no famous book or movie about the incident, no place in the broader cultural memory of America's Cold War struggles. This lack of recognition adds another layer of injustice to what happened. These men died serving their country, and their sacrifice has been largely forgotten by that country. They deserve better. They deserve to be remembered not just as victims of a North Korean attack, but as examples of the service and dedication that military personnel show even in unglamorous, dangerous jobs that most people never know about. The technical intelligence work that the EC-121 crews were doing was critical to national security during the Cold War. By monitoring enemy communications and radar, they provided early warning of potential attacks. They helped map out enemy capabilities and vulnerabilities. They gave American military planners the information they needed to develop strategies and contingencies. This work saved lives and prevented conflicts by ensuring that the United States knew what it was dealing with. But because this work was classified, the people doing it couldn't talk about it. Their families often didn't know exactly what they did. The public certainly didn't understand the importance of reconnaissance missions. So when these men died, it was hard to explain why their work mattered and why their deaths were significant. They became casualties in a war most people didn't know was being fought. Looking at this incident from today's perspective, with everything we know about how North Korea has developed over the past 50 years, it's tempting to wonder what would have happened if the United States had responded differently. If Nixon had authorized strikes against North Korea, would that have changed the regime's behavior? Would it have deterred future provocations? Or would it have started a war that would have been even worse than the decades of tension and threats we've actually experienced? We can't know the answer to these counterfactual questions. History only happened one way, and we can't rerun the experiment with different choices to see what would have occurred. But we can observe that the choice that was made, restraint in the face of aggression, established a pattern that North Korea has exploited ever since. Whether a different choice would have produced better results is unknowable, but the results we got weren't great. The incident also highlights the challenges of intelligence gathering in a world where countries guard their secrets jealously and view surveillance as threatening. The United States needed to know what North Korea was doing militarily. The only way to get that information was to fly reconnaissance missions along their borders. But North Korea viewed these missions as provocative and hostile, even when they were conducted in international airspace. This fundamental conflict between the need to gather intelligence and the desire to prevent surveillance has never been resolved. Today, we have satellites and cyber capabilities that can gather some intelligence without putting crews at risk in vulnerable aircraft. But human intelligence and signals intelligence still require getting close to targets in ways that can be dangerous. The basic tension that led to the EC-121 shootdown still exists. Countries still shoot down or harass reconnaissance aircraft and drones. The technology has changed, but the underlying issues haven't. One aspect of this story that deserves attention is how the crew members were trained and prepared for their mission. They went through extensive technical training to operate the surveillance equipment. They learned procedures for what to do if intercepted or challenged by foreign aircraft. They understood the risks involved in flying near hostile territory. But nobody really prepared them for the possibility that North Korea would just shoot them down without warning in international airspace, because that wasn't supposed to happen according to the norms and rules that governed these operations. This points to a broader problem with how we think about risk and safety in military operations. We plan for the threats we expect and understand. We develop procedures and protocols based on past experience and reasonable assumptions about how adversaries will behave. But sometimes adversaries do things that are unexpected and unreasonable, and when that happens, people die despite all the training and preparation. The investigation after the shootdown tried to determine if anything could have been done differently to prevent it, or if there were any lessons that could improve safety for future missions. The conclusion was basically that the crew had done everything right. They followed their flight plan, stayed in international airspace, conducted their mission professionally. North Korea just decided to shoot them down anyway. The only way to have prevented it would have been to not fly the mission at all, which wasn't an acceptable option given the intelligence requirements. So the lessons that came out of the investigation were mostly about defensive measures. Future reconnaissance missions would have fighter escorts to protect them. Aircraft would carry better defensive equipment to detect and evade missiles. Procedures were updated to give crews more authority to abort missions if they felt threatened. But the fundamental vulnerability remained. Reconnaissance aircraft operating near hostile territory are always at risk, and sometimes that risk materializes in the worst possible way. The two MiG pilots who shot down the EC-121 were reportedly celebrated as heroes in North Korea. They were given medals and promotions. Their actions were held up as examples of revolutionary vigilance and defense of the homeland. This is standard practice in North Korea, where any confrontation with America or its allies is portrayed as a great victory regardless of the actual circumstances. We don't know the names of these pilots or what happened to them later in life. They might have gone on to distinguished military careers. They might have fallen victim to one of Kim Il-sung's periodic purges of the military. They might have died in training accidents, which were common in North Korea's poorly maintained air force. Or they might have lived long lives and died peacefully, never facing any consequences for killing 31 men who posed no threat to them or their country. This is part of what makes the story so frustrating. The individuals directly responsible for the attack were rewarded by their government and protected from any form of justice or accountability. The families of their victims had to live with knowing that the men who killed their loved ones were being celebrated while they grieved. There was no trial, no punishment, no acknowledgement that a crime had been committed. Just competing narratives about what happened and why, with North Korea insisting they were defending their territory and everyone else knowing that was a lie. The incident reminds us that international law only works when countries choose to follow it, and when there are mechanisms to enforce it. North Korea violated international law by attacking an aircraft in international airspace. But there was no international court that could hold them accountable, no police force that could arrest the perpetrators, no way to impose justice except through the actions of individual countries. And those countries, primarily the United States, chose not to enforce the law through military means because the costs seemed too high. This is the fundamental weakness of international law in a world of sovereign states. It depends on voluntary compliance and collective enforcement. When a country decides to ignore the law and other countries decide that enforcement isn't worth the cost, the law becomes meaningless. The EC-121 incident is an example of this dynamic playing out with deadly consequences. As we reach the end of this story, I want to come back to where we started. This is the incident that America tried to forget, not through any conspiracy or cover-up, but through the simple process of moving on to other concerns and letting this moment fade from public memory. The government didn't want to dwell on it because doing so would raise uncomfortable questions about why there was no retaliation. The media moved on to other stories because the public wasn't demanding continued coverage. And gradually, the EC-121 shootdown became a footnote in Cold War history that most people never learn about. But the families remember. The military remembers. And the handful of historians and researchers who study this period remember. Because even if the broader public has forgotten, the incident still matters. It matters as an example of the challenges of deterrence and the limits of military power. It matters as a reminder that decisions about war and peace have real human costs. And it matters as part of the story of how North Korea became what it is today. The 31 men who died on April 15, 1969, deserve to be remembered not just as victims, but as service members who were doing important work in dangerous circumstances. They deserve to have their story told so that people understand what happened to them and why it matters. They deserve to be honored for their sacrifice, even though that sacrifice didn't lead to the kind of response that might have prevented future provocations. And we deserve to understand this incident because it tells us something important about the world we live in. It shows us how authoritarian regimes test boundaries and exploit the risk aversion of democracies. It shows us that justice and accountability are often sacrificed on the altar of political expedience. And it shows us that the costs of these decisions are borne by real people whose lives matter just as much as any grand strategic calculation. If this story matters to you, hit subscribe so more people can learn what really happened.